Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Megan Easley-Walsh, and this is History Stories. With a PhD in history, as an author, a writing consultant, and editor, my life is full of history and stories. With that in mind, this podcast's goal is to explore some of those stories of history. This will include diving into antiques and interesting historical artifacts that I found, looking behind the scenes at inspiration for my novels, taking a peek at places I visited, and uncovering new topics of interest. Thank you for joining me. Let's begin. In this episode, we're exploring the year 1884 and how it shaped my life. In my kitchen, I have a chest of drawers full of tablecloths, placemats, and other linens. But the object that I'm going to talk to you about today isn't found inside of the drawers. Instead, it sits on top. A box, smaller than a shoebox in size, made of wood with some inlaid design and a detail that is perhaps made of mother-of-pearl shell, caught my eye at an antique fair recently. If you open the box, there are two compartments inside. On the outside, there is a lock with a key in it. What is this object? Perhaps you're thinking it's a jewelry box, but that isn't the case. Instead, it's a tea caddy. From a time when tea was so prized that it had to be locked away. Like Nathaniel in my novel Meridian, this tea caddy is English and it's Victorian. My third novel, in order of how they were written, although different from the order in which they were published, is Meridian. The lives of several characters are woven together to illustrate the overlapping and interconnectedness of the year 1884. We'll explore more of their stories in future episodes of History Stories. So, how did I become interested in the year 1884? It started with the BBC. I was near the end of writing my second novel, What Edward Heard, and I was starting to think about what I would write about next. We were watching a TV show about navigation and maps. In it, they mentioned the 1884 Prime Meridian Conference. At the time, I had never heard of this event before. I was intrigued. In 1884, two major map systems were in place. The British system was zero longitude placed at Greenwich, and the French system was zero longitude running through Paris. As steel tracks were laid across the lands and telegraph wires connected towns, a system of lines, a unified system for the world, was recognized as being important. At the invitation of American President Chester A. Arthur, the countries of the world were invited to assemble and determine where that meridian would be placed. For centuries, sailors had looked to the sky to navigate by the stars. Now, the titans of industry and of science, the stars of their own age, were turning the eyes of the navigators towards a new North Star. It was to be 0 degrees running through Greenwich, the single and unified prime meridian. In the last episode, I quoted Juliet Nicholson and her assertion that World War I put an end to Victorian certainties. But that's not entirely true. Greenwich is still where the prime meridian is located, and this affects both the standardization of time and navigation. In some ways, we are very much 21st century Victorians. The International Prime Meridian Conference of 1884 proved to be such a fascinating topic to me that I wrote a novel about it, and then I realized there was still so much to explore. Those further explorations, diving into the archives and linking it to broader global events, became the bedrock of my doctoral thesis, entitled 1884, Determining the Meridian to Map a Changing World, How a Scientific Problem Established a New World Order. Something that stood out to me most about the 1884 conference was that it was a precursor to the League of Nations after World War I, or the United Nations that was founded after World War II, with one very important difference. This coming together of 26 nations and conference didn't happen because of war. It happened for a peaceful purpose. In my first two novels, Flight Before Dawn and What Edward Heard, I wrote about the two world wars. In Meridian, I wanted to write about something entirely different: peace. As I spoke about in the last episode while discussing my novel What Edward Heard, the horrors of war were magnified by mechanization in the First World War. But before bloodshed and battle, cooperation was magnified through scientific necessity, economic prosperity, and desire for goodwill. This is what happened at the conference, where those in attendance came together for safety of the seas, for better shipping, for standardization. It can be tempting to measure history by wars. To do so, though, is to deny the power of peace. Through peace, progress can be made. Through peace, international cooperation can be achieved. And through peace, international history was made. To only tell the story of international relations or of history from the viewpoint of war by pointing to a need for peace after the First World War, as in the League of Nations, or the Second World War, as in United Nations, is to rewrite history. Yes, peace was needed, and international cooperation was needed after these two global atrocities, but peace had already made possible the coming together of the nations. In the relative lull of strife in the mid-1880s, at least in Europe, where peace among the European nations made it possible, science and industry through diplomatic conference could be pursued, and it was, in Washington, D.C. in 1884. In my novel Meridian, Nathaniel, as a tea merchant, represents one of those areas of commerce. When his ship is shipwrecked in the beginning of Meridian, he learns firsthand the importance of navigating by a unified prime meridian, and he becomes invested in the outcome of the conference. Rudyard Kipling of Jungle Book fame said, quote, "If history were taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten." End quote. As historians and as writers, we tell stories about war so that their atrocities will not be forgotten, and in the hopes that future horrors might be prevented. But it is also important that as writers and as historians that we tell stories about peace. Those too are stories worth remembering. Those too are stories worth preserving. They too can be a point of unification. Thank you for joining me for this episode of History Stories. To find out more about my writing and my research, visit me at meganeasley-walsh.com. You can find my novel Meridian on Amazon, and my full doctoral thesis is available on ProQuest. I look forward to sharing more history stories with you in the next episode.